This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. Every year, the Museum of the RCMI holds an annual military history symposium on defined themes in the Canadian military experience. Our 2020 symposium was cancelled because of the pandemic, but on November the 6th, we returned with a virtual fourth symposium entitled Canadian Military History at Large. Our host was Museum Director and Curator Ryan Goldsworthy. Our eminent speakers were historian Tyler Wentzel, Ryan Goldsworthy, RCMI Museum Committee member Andris Travers, and RCMI's Honourary historian Tim Cook.
So this leads me to the introduction of our first speaker, Tyler Wentzel. So Tyler is a lawyer, a historian, and an infantry officer. His first book, Not for King or Country, Edward Cecil Smith, Communist Party of Canada and the Spanish Civil War, is now published with the University of Toronto Press. Tyler teaches military law and public law at the Canadian Forces College and at the University of Toronto. Tyler, as I mentioned, who was scheduled to launch his new book just prior to the pandemic, now has a renewed opportunity to speak about it to the RCMI audience. Tyler, I'll pass it over to you for your part.
Thank you very much, Ryan. All right. So, when the international brigades of the Spanish Civil War were disbanded in 1938, Isidore Ibarruri, better known as La Pasionare, or the Passion Flower, addressed them, saying that they had given up everything: their loves, their country's home and fortune, fathers, mothers, wives, brothers, sisters, and children. She continued, "And they came and said to us, 'We are here. Your cause, Spain's cause, is ours. It is the cause of all advanced and progressive mankind.' She told the volunteers, 'You can go proudly. You are history. You are legend.' And with that, the international brigades were no more." The international brigades are indeed legendary, but there is more than one legend here. First, you have the idea of the premature anti-fascists. This was the idea that the sole cause of the international volunteers was to prop up Spanish democracy in the face of fascist aggression. One could prescribe to this goal if you were a Democrat, a socialist, or a dyed-in-the-wool communist. They were premature in that their war just preceded the Second World War, when the Allied powers eventually rallied to combat the fascist states, Franco's Spain excluded. The second is the Comintern Army thesis, the idea that foreign volunteers were strictly proxies of Moscow. Employing modern terms, you might think of this idea as Russia's little green men in Spain, the difference between the incursion in Crimea and in Spain simply being that one succeeded while the other failed. These two ideas permeate almost everything that's been written on the foreign volunteers in Spain. If one subscribes to the premature anti-fascist idea, writers tend to downplay the role of the Soviet Union and the world's communist parties. If one falls into the Comintern Army school of thought, you perhaps ignore the legitimate personal motivations of the volunteers and the widespread public support of those volunteers. This tension persists in the literature today, in spite of the end of the Cold War and the opening up of the Soviet records. As always, the truth lies somewhere in between. And in my research, I'm trying to take a clear-eyed view of the degree of Soviet influence within the international brigades. Today, I will take you through a case study of one particular unit, the 15th Brigade, which included the nominally Canadian Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, the MacPaps, the American Abraham Lincoln Battalion, and the British Battalion and Anti-Tank Battery in the first half of the Aragon Offensive in March 1938. This battle is especially notable as was the first direct confrontation between the 15th Brigade and massed mechanized and armored forces in the form of the Italian Corpo Truppe Volontarii. So to begin, who were the volunteers? First, we know that while small numbers made their way to Spain early in the conflict when it broke out in July 1936, the communist movement took the lead in recruiting, vetting, and dispatching foreign volunteers. We know that more than 3/4 of the Canadian and American volunteers, about which we have the best data, were members of their communist parties or their young communist leagues. We know that Trotskyists and similar dissidents were screened out. Here you can see some prototypical examples in leadership appointments. On the left, Vladimir Chopik, the commander for most of the 15th Brigade's existence. He was a founder and leader in the Yugoslav Communist Party. He had mostly spent his years following the First World War living in exile in Moscow. He briefly served as the brigade commissar and then as the brigade commander. Top left, Sandor Voros, one of the brigade commissars, a Hungarian American. He joined the Communist Party in 1929. He did some journalism and principally worked full-time as a party functionary. Top right, Nilo Makala and Edward Cecil Smith, the MacPaps Machine Gun Company commander and commanding officer, respectively. Makala was Finnish Canadian. Finnish Canadians and Americans were a very common demographic within the foreign volunteers, a miner and a lumberjack, as well as a journalist and organizer for the Communist Party in and around Timmins and Sudbury. Edward Cecil Smith, the subject of my book, was an active journalist and organizer for the Communist Party of Canada. Among other things, he was a national board member of the Friends of the Soviet Union and was on the editorial board of the magazine Soviet Russia Today. Bottom left was the brigade chief of staff, Bob Merriman. Based on available records, he was not a member of the American Communist Party. However, having completed his undergraduate degree and ROTC training in the United States, Merriman was in Moscow studying Soviet economics when the Spanish Civil War broke out. He came to the battlefields of Spain directly from the Soviet Union and was almost immediately made a battalion commander before being promoted to brigade chief of staff, and he spoke Russian fluently. Below right, Sam Wilde, the commander of the British battalion. Wilde had been a member of the Royal Navy for 11 years, and he had participated in the Invergordon Mutiny of September 1931. He was an active member of the Communist Party of Great Britain and known to be tough as nails. He was a type of commander that if he came upon a fight between two troops, he would proceed to fight both of the troops himself and usually win. So while I could be accused of cherry picking evidence here, there's a strong correlation between membership in a communist party and the likelihood of receiving leadership appointments. The same was not necessarily true of the rank and file, but it was true among the leaders and commissars. They were overwhelmingly composed of members of home communist parties, Bob Merriman being a notable exception, but not without significant connections to the Soviet Union. The communist movement was part of every aspect of a volunteer's experience from beginning to end. The parties did the vetting and helped volunteers get passports. The image on the left was Cecil Smith's border crossing documents. Most claimed that they were going to Paris to see the World's Fair. Canadians were brought to Toronto where they received luggage, some clothes, rail tickets, and instructions. They went to New York by rail, where they received a ticket, third class, on a White Star Line ship, and then moved through a network of safe houses that eventually brought them to the brigade headquarters in Albacete, Spain, where they received their training. And once there, they remained largely dependent on their home party's role in generating public support. The Friends of the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, for instance, held rallies, they built care package, and they fundraised for the Canadians in Spain. The group was largely managed by members of the Communist Party, but it was notably supported widely by other sectors of the community. Troops received niceties such as chocolate and cigarettes, but also mission essential kit like warm blankets, and their boots mostly came from Canada. And some donations were even more consequential. On the right, you see the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion's battalion ambulance, purchased and equipped with donations from private Canadian citizens. The ambulance was named Tom Ewan, after the Communist Party leader and director of the Workers' Unity League. Two of his sons fought in Spain, and his daughter, a nurse, went with Norman Bethune to China. Other assets came directly from the Soviet Union. The brigade's 45mm anti-tank guns, manned by British gunners, came from the Soviet Union. They were the brigade's only organic anti-tank weapons. Similarly, the brigade's heavy machine guns, Maxims, came from the Soviet Union, seen here with the distinctive carriage and shield. The unit's medium machine guns were about half Soviet and half from the Skoda works in Czechoslovakia. So there were Canadians firing Bren guns in combat as early as 1937. With these key weapon systems came trainers from the Red Army, and with those trainers came advisors. Cecil Smith described the advisors as falling into one of three categories. Quote, Senior officers attached to divisional, Army Corps, and Army staff as advisors or experts in various arms, captains and subalterns in the brigades, and instructors in the officer and non-commissioned officer training centers, as well as artillery, tank, small arms, and other schools. Most of the staff officers, Cecil Smith wrote, spoke through an interpreter, but Cecil Smith believed most of them spoke English quite well, as they often corrected errors made by their interpreters. And in combat, he said, "I never saw a single one play the coward." Although the international brigades initially had advisors in the schools, on the staffs, and as low as the battalion and sometimes even company level, this contribution began to wane by the winter of 1937. Red Army advisors were being pulled either into the heartland of the Soviet Union or were being sent to the Far East in response to the conflict there. Although there were only 2 advisors within the 15th Brigade at the time of the battle in question, these advisors did a great deal. The offensive in question was unexpected. So Vladimir Chopik, the brigade commander, had gone on leave to visit his wife. Bob Merriman, as chief of staff, was in charge, along with the brigade's 2 remaining Red Army advisors, Ivan Nikhailovich and Nikolai Monslenev, nicknamed Maxim. These advisors were theoretically only advisors and not in command. However, even before the brigade suffered serious degradation that resulted in a mishmash of commands, it was clear that the advisors were doing more than simply advising. Arthur Landis, a survivor of the battle and author of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, only cautiously declared Bob Merriman to be the brigade commander, saying that consensus among the volunteers was that it was not clear who was in command, although Merriman was the only one who exhibited real leadership during the battle. On the other hand, 2 brigade commissars, Sandor Voros and John Gerlach, both stated that the Red Army advisors were actually in command throughout the battle. Gerlach recalled that Merriman, quote, "just had the stripes. It was just a story." Furthermore, the 15th Brigade report on the first stage of the battle explicitly stated that Maxim, Nikolai Monslenev, was the brigade's commander from 9th to 17th March. This status is especially important given that the 15th Brigade's higher headquarters, the 35th Division, was commanded by a General Walter. Walter's real name was Karol Swiderski, and he was a serving Red Army officer. This is a photo of him after the Second World War. So based on the reports of the battalion commanders and commissars that survived the battle, Merriman exercised most functions of command during the battle. However, the Red Army advisors issued orders to battalion commanders, and these commanders obeyed without any expressed concern. This was likely necessary given the chaos of the battle, but it's not clear how much Merriman treated the advisors' advice as merely advice or true direction. Merriman was captured and killed in the battle, and the diary he kept during the battle was lost. All right, so on to the battle. Here's the map. First off, I'd like to thank Mike Bechtold, who did the maps for my book. He does great work, so if you need maps done, I cannot recommend him enough. This is the entire battle area. The main black line going from west to east shows the path taken by the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion as they retreated from the advancing nationalists during March and February. On the right to the east, you'll see the Mediterranean Sea, and you'll also see indicators showing the Republic's counterattacks the following summer. And at the top, you'll see markers showing the location of the 15th Brigade's attacks at Fuentes de Ebro at the top and Seguro de los Baños in the south. So suffice it to say, the 15th Brigade had fought over this land more than once. On the top left, that's the location of the approximate nationalist line at the opening stage of the battle. And for scale, the distance between Azuera on the left in the west and La Serra, that's about 20 kilometers. All right, so after the resource-intensive effort of retaking the city of Teruel, further to the south on this map, from Republican forces from December 1937 until February 1938, the Nationalists were ready for a deep offensive through the Aragon region by early March. At the time, the Nationalists had consolidated their control of Spain by seizing the Basque territory in the north. The Nationalists controlled the north and the west of Spain. So it was time, and they'd been unable to take Madrid, so it was time to do something bold. It was time to do something bold to solidify German and Italian support for the Nationalists. This bold plan would be splitting the Republic in half, isolating Catalonia in the east from the Madrid-Valencia corridor in the west. Franco assembled a force of 150,000 nationalist soldiers, supported by 700 artillery pieces, 200 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft, which would cut through the Republican lines on 9 March. Although the Republic had comparable numbers of troops in this sector, they had nothing resembling the armor, anti-armor, artillery, or aviation support, and they never had anything close to local superiority. This was not true blitzkrieg, as it's sometimes framed, because the coordination with air assets was minimal, and tanks were still applied in the penny packets supporting the infantry. But there were important similarities. The Nationalists would punch a hole in the line and quickly exploit with truck-mounted and half-track mounted infantry, cavalry, and tanks operating close support, moving cross-country, while other forces advanced along main roads. But the Republicans did not know that that was happening yet. They were taken entirely by surprise. So the battle that we'll be talking about for the rest of the talk is what took place during the first half of the battle, phase 1, if you will, of the retreats, which is shown here in the red box. And here's a zoom in of that. So when the Nationalists attacked, the 15th Brigade had no useful information that such an attack was coming. As I said, Chopik was on leave, Dave Duran, the brigade commissar, was on leave, the brigade chief of operations, Malcolm Dunbar, was on leave. The Lincoln Battalion's entire the headquarters, for the most part, both went on leave. The 15th Brigade occupied administrative positions in La Serra, La Tux, and Belchite. But on the morning of 9th March, they learned of the offensive the hard way. They heard Nationalist aircraft and artillery bombardment in the distance. They did not receive communications from the forward units. They did not have clear intelligence that an attack, certainly not an attack of this size, was coming. By 10 a.m., Republican soldiers began to withdraw through the International Brigade positions. Clearly, something terrible was happening at the front. Merriman sent his brigade scouts forward to conduct reconnaissance of what was happening and to communicate it, and he established company-sized fighting patrols along the key routes as tripwires. Later that day, the brigade received instructions to establish a secondary line of defense. So the 4 battalions of the brigade were moved forward. The Lincolns, already in Belchite, would march west to establish a defensive position, supported by the British Battalion and Anti-Tank Battery, who had to march up from La Serra overnight. This would be the main brigade defensive area. Preventing that position from being outflanked, the MacPaps would defend along another major route coming from Fuentedoros to northwest of Azuara. And in the middle, mostly preventing any cross-country penetration, the Spanish battalion would block in the middle. This was a frontage of about 15 kilometers, which was not unreasonable for a brigade of almost 3,500 troops. Now, of course, the plan fell apart almost immediately. In Belchite, the message did not make it to the Lincoln Battalion. Even though they were closest to the advancing enemy and could have established the best blocking position soonest, they did not step off until after midnight, when brigade headquarters arrived. They began their march in the middle of the night, just as the British Battalion and Anti-Tank Battery began to arrive. The Americans started to march west, and instead of defending from a prepared line, they ended up in a meeting engagement with the Nationalists. They took heavy casualties almost immediately, including the loss of almost the entire battalion headquarters to an artillery strike. To their right, the British jockeyed for position and did their best, but they never formed a cohesive line. All 5 of the anti-tank guns were destroyed by air attack very early in the battle. Maxim, the Russian advisor, ordered a retreat from Belchite. In the middle of the brigade position, the Spanish battalion similarly ended up in a meeting engagement. They never formed their line, and the battalion scattered to such extent that it did not fight as a battalion again for the rest of the battle. And then there were the MacPaps in Azuara. Cecil Smith had initially been ordered to advance until he could link up with Spanish troops, but that order was countermanded and countermanded again, and then he could not make contact at all with brigade headquarters. When he began to see thousands of nationalist troops with hundreds of trucks preparing for an assault on his position, he pulled back from his assigned position and into the town of Azuara. He put his machine gunners up high in these cliffs shown here and desperately tried to make contact with brigade. His signalers cut into the civilian telephone system and were able to reach the battalion's kitchen, which they had left in the rear. But the kitchen didn't know what was going on either. They couldn't get any information. So then Cecil Smith sent a runner back to see if he could find the brigade headquarters. And that runner just happened to stumble upon General Walter's staff car on the road. And it was only when Cecil Smith went back to the rear to meet with General Walter, once that contact had been established, that he learned of the disaster that had befallen the rest of the brigade up in Belshidi. The battalion pulled off their positions in Azawara on the morning of 11 March under heavy nationalist attack and marched back to Lacera. Some machine gunners were tragically left behind in the cliffs, unable to withdraw. So the MacPaps were now the largest of the surviving battalions. The rest of the brigade was effectively the size of a battalion at this point, although they stayed under their battalion chain of command. Already reduced from 500, the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, already reduced from 500 to somewhere between 200 and 300, was still the biggest battalion, so it provided the rear guard as the brigade moved to the east. Along their way, fatigue and panic took their toll. The 15th Brigade recorded 12 March as, quote, the day when the tragic part of the retreat had begun. Units mixed together and commanders lost control of their formations. Soldiers dispersed when attacked from the air by tanks or cavalry on their flanks. Over time, they were disinclined to come back together. Cecil Smith recorded that a panic developed on the highway, with different units mixing together and widespread confusion. Commissar Sander Voros described the state of the 15th Brigade as, quote, the brigade as a unified fighting force no longer exists. There is no chain of command, no liaison, no battalions, no companies, only isolated groups of men putting up last-ditch resistance, holding until surrounded, retreating to other posts, holding with diminished numbers, dispersed, falling back in isolated groups to rally again. The planes attack constantly. The greatest damage they do is to morale. Only poorly trained men panic at the appearance of the fascist planes. They bolt and run, leaving their equipment behind. End quote. The state of affairs was worsened when the brigade was ordered to pivot from Alcanaz as their destination to the town of Casp. Cecil Smith was one of the troops that did not receive the message. So the commander of the battalion in the rear guard did not receive the message. The Italians had already seized Alcanaz. They had advanced cross country and closed the pincer. So the decision was made to converge on Casp up here in the north and provide a last-ditch effort. Cecil Smith, you can see in the dashed line, made his way on foot from Hajar to Maea, which was the second most largest concentration of troops. Him and a few others hitchhiked to the front to join the fight in Casp. By 13 March, David Doran, a Communist Party leader, and the brigade commissars, not a commander, showing that the distinction between a political officer and a commander could be blurred, had returned from his leave in Valencia, and he took command of the 15th Brigade's defense at Casp. Merriman was missing. The Russian advisors issued orders, and they struggled to put together a force of 700 or so soldiers, really a large battalion, not a brigade, to repel the 5th Navarre Division, which was approaching from the west. The brigade was heavily dispersed in the chaos. Even though they only had 700 or so troops there, it wasn't that the remainder of the 3,500 troops in the brigade had been killed or injured, although many had. They'd simply been dispersed and they couldn't concentrate their combat power at any point. Sam Wilde led the British battalion, or what was left of it, in blocking a rail line through the hills and into the town, the route by which the Nationalists tried to infiltrate on 15 March. A mixed force, led by Finnish-Canadian volunteer Niilo Makala, fought to hold Reservoir Hill, the terrain feature dominating the routes in and out of the town. Makala's force withdrew around dusk. A Nationalist tank shell wounded him as he pulled off the position, and he later died of his wounds. Cecil Smith arrived in Casp at roughly the same time. Doran immediately gave him the task of retaking Reservoir Hill. Cecil Smith's attack succeeded in retaking the hill in the early hours of 16 March. With 100 soldiers, the counterattack seized the hill, 30 prisoners of war, 3 heavy Fiat machine guns, 50 to 60 rifles, and 10 mules. The brigade report called the attack something worthy of glory. By dawn, however, Cecil Smith's force was low on ammunition, and the Nationalists who infiltrated the town were firing on his force from behind. Cecil Smith's troops withdrew. He confessed, "I had lost control of the men," and the door to Caspe was open. The Nationalists took Caspe on 17 March. The Nationalists achieved their immediate objectives, smashing the Republican front lines, pushing their mobile forces. There's an image of the Church of Caspe. The Nationalists achieved their immediate objectives, smashing the Republican lines, pushing their mobile forces forward rapidly along multiple axes, and seizing their immediate objectives. The offensive surpassed Franco's expectations. On 15 March, he ordered the continue of advancement, and they would proceed to push all the way down to the Mediterranean. Republican units rushed from the south, were able to check the Nationalist advance, such that units like the 15th Brigade could withdraw and reorganize. The brigade converged on the town of Battea, 40 kilometers southeast, where they had a welcome respite and they had a chance to take stock of their casualties. They began the battle with nearly 3,500 troops. They ended it with less than half of that, and having lost almost all their heavy weapons and equipment. The Lincoln Battalion began the fight with 230 soldiers. More than half were killed, injured, or captured. The MacPaps began with 500 soldiers and ended with 250, but only half of them still had a weapon. The British battalion only mustered 20 soldiers in Battea, down from almost 300. Replacements arrived from leave, the hospitals, and training facilities. Some were veterans, either with earlier experience in battle or valuable time in the training system, but many were largely untrained Spanish conscripts. The influx of untrained troops required that even the most junior among the foreign soldiers were propelled into leadership positions. The reinforcements brought the brigade up to 2,329. Sandor Voros recalled, "We're an international brigade in name only now." So that's the end of my talk. I have, in an effort of self-promotion, placed an image of the book on the screen, my Twitter handle, and my email address. If this is of interest to you, please grab a copy of the book, available where fine books are sold, and feel free to reach out to me. I'm deeply interested in the subject and happy to discuss with anyone who's also interested in it. Thank you very much for your time.
Hello again. I wish to thank Tyler for a very interesting talk there. My connection with the Spanish Civil War involves my own family, my mother's family. Two of her brothers-in-law fought for the Nationalists, and my grandfather, being a supporter of the Republicans, ended up with his family as refugees in the north around the main battle area around the River Ebro. And while I never got to know much about what went on, because nothing was said within the family, I thank Tyler for opening my eyes, and I'm now more keenly interested in the subject. Thank you.
Yes.
I also take this opportunity to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Ryan Goldsworthy. Ryan is the Museum Director and Curator at the Royal Canadian Military Institute, where he manages the Institute's extensive museum collection. At the RCMI, he has amassed the most diverse and complete collection of Canadian First World War uniforms in existence. It is truly a big collection. He was formerly an educator and a First World War historian, and at the Military Museums of Calgary. He has published various journals, including the Canadian Military Journal and the RCMI's journal Citra. He also serves on the Museum Committee of the Second Intelligence Company. It gives me great pleasure to reintroduce you back to Ryan, and he will now begin his talk.
Thank you, Andy, for that kind introduction. Just bear with me for a moment while I share my presentation. Again, thanks, Andy, and to Tyler as well, just so I can say my part. I really enjoyed your presentation. And it's not one we hear very often, I think, in Canadian military history circles. So once again, thank you for that. Right on. So as a director and the curator of the RCMI, I'm going to say this is going to be my genuine pleasure and my delight to give this talk to our great audience today. So as I said from the start, we're very happy to once again welcome everyone to the return of our annual military history symposium following this long, impactful pandemic. As I'm sure you know, it's really had a big impact on the cultural sector. So to have this once again, to be here, even though we're not doing this in person, it really is a happy day. So thanks again for joining us. So as you can see on my title card here today, my talk today will be about the history of Canada's First World War through artifacts. Right, so just as a quick outline before I get going here. So I'll be speaking for about 25 to 30 minutes. And in this time, I'm going to start with a very brief overview of the importance of material history and the RCMI Museum. And then I'll continue on with the meat of the talk, which will basically be a history of the Canadian Expeditionary Force through the lens of 4 representative artifacts from our museum collection. So first off, given that each of these objects that I'll be speaking on today are all from within the RCMI's museum collection, I'm just going to say a few quick words on the museum itself. So as Andy alluded to, in my role as the head of the RCMI Museum, I've been responsible for creating our many exhibitions and for expanding our exceptional museum collection since I arrived here in the spring of 2016. So the Museum of the RCMI is nearly as old as the Institute itself, as we've been collecting and maintaining artifacts since 1907. The museum is the largest military museum in Toronto, and it's one of the largest in Canada with over 12,000 artifacts and archival materials in our collection. The museum actually has over 6 floors of display space and galleries kind of interweave throughout the Institute for those who have been here before. We also possess, I would say, one of the most exceptional and complete collection of firearms, uniforms, and medal sets in the world. So that's really the strength of our collection. I've got 2 of our special uniforms just behind me here. We have an 85th Battalion Stretcher Bearers tunic named to a Private Giffen. And on the other side, we have an officer's jacket to the 19th Battalion. And this is going to have a little bit of a connection later on, so more to come. So since I became the museum curator and now director of the museum, I've consistently championed the importance of physical objects in generating wider interest in our history and to the historical record itself. So the 3 objects you see here on this slide all originate from our Great War collection. On the far left there, you have a Canadian Garrison artillery jacket and painted Brodie helmet. It's probably as good as you'll ever see. In the middle there, we have a 22nd Battalion attack at Vimy by war artist William Barnes Woolen. It's a great contemporary piece, created in 1920. And on the other side, we have a Mark I Hotchkiss machine gun. And this guy here, all 3 of these are on display, by the way, at the RCMI. So this Hotchkiss is quite rare. And this particular example was pulled from a ruined tank in 1917. So it's had a long journey to get here. And it's really a great piece, not one you'd see in many military museums in the world, let alone Canada. So objects such as these and the others that I'm going to be speaking to today, I would say are an indelible and a physical connection to our nation's past and its legacy. These military objects or artifacts, which are often managed by our museums and our cultural institutions, are important primary sources for the purpose of understanding and appreciating our military history. I would say there's, and I'm sure many of you would agree with me, that there's an irreplaceable or an indescribable quality in viewing these pieces, in living color when you're walking through the galleries of a museum such as the RCMI. I would say the artifacts are the de facto witnesses to history. They can reveal equally as much to us by what they both do and do not show us. I ultimately believe that these objects have become even more increasingly valuable historically, as they're testimonials of the past in lieu of our now bereft living memory of the First World War. So just as a bit of background on the First World War itself, before I get into the artifacts. So obviously during the war, more than 600,000 Canadians and Newfoundlanders served in the Allied Armed Forces, and approximately 66,000 Canadians lost their lives as a result of the war, which is a higher total than all of Canada's other conflicts combined. It's really an insane statistic. So though Canada paid a great price in the fields of France and Flanders during the First World War, our contribution to the final Allied victory was significant, if not war-winning. The vaunted Canadian Corps would not lose a battle in the final 2 years of the war, the only overseas formation who could make this claim. Our nation's single greatest contribution to victory came in the closing months of the war during the 100 Days Offensive. Indeed, in those final months, from the 8th of August to 11th November 1918, Canadians liberated 500 square miles of territory, 228 French and Belgian cities, towns, and villages, and they defeated roughly 1/4 of the German army. Not bad for a small Dominion nation of only 8 million people with no regular standing military prior to 1914. So Tim will speak more to this precise topic of liberation at the end of the war in the final lecture today. So one result of Canada's great participation in the war was the proliferation of an exceptional material history. Many of Canada's greatest moments and figures of the war are even better understood through the objects left behind and which have defied the odds to survive today. Since 1919, many thousands of these valuable Canadian First World War objects have come to reside within the museum of the RCMI. This leads me to the first. So this that you see here is a Canadian barrage map, which is dated April 1917, pretty significant month in Canadian history. So this original Canadian artillery map that you see here is labeled La Folie Farm, which was a sector near Vimy Ridge in France. So the map itself offers us a detailed topographical depiction of the sizable area between Neuville-Saint-Vaast and the southwest corner of the map, and Petit Vimy up in the northeast corner of the map. So at a 1 to 5,000 scale, this map was issued by the Canadian Corps Topographical Section, and it was based on the geographic research provided by the First Field Survey Company of the British Royal Engineers. So the map you see here was provided to Canadian artillery officers and gunners as a part of the preparation for the massive artillery barrages on the German positions at Vimy Ridge in April 1917. This specific example was kept and preserved by Captain Leslie Gordon Mills of the 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles. Mills, who was actually born in 1890, which coincidentally was the same year the RCMI was founded, donated his entire personal collection to the Institute in May 1969. He passed away 2 years later in April 1971, almost to the 54 years to the day of the Battle of Vimy Ridge. So back to Vimy just for a moment, which I would say by popular recognition and acclamation is perhaps the most iconic achievement in Canada's whole military history, let alone the First World War. I'm sure we all remember the fanfare of its centennial commemoration in 2017. But the battle itself, which occurred between April 9th and the 12th, 1917, was a part of the larger offensive, the Battle of Arras. So the overall objective of Arras was to consume German resources, draw the Germans away from the simultaneous French offensive to the south, the Nivelle offensive, and to capture the German positions on the high ground of the Douai Plain. So within the larger offensive, the Canadians were tasked specifically with capturing Vimy, highly defensible German position. So the Canadian Corps, which was then under the command of Julian Byng, swiftly captured the ridge and effectively ushered in the first tangible Allied victory since 1914. The Canadian victory at Vimy was hailed by the Allies, and it served to raise the profile of the Canadian Corps as one of the most professional, reliable, and hard-hitting formations in France. So one of the hallmarks of Byng's leadership, and this is where this map sort of ties back in, was at Vimy, he sort of had a commitment to education and more operation-learned soldiers. So in a revolutionary move, more than 40,000 detailed maps, including this exact example, were disseminated to all of the soldiers of the Canadian Corps. The men of the Corps therefore knew the terrain, their direction, and all of the objectives before the battle even began. This differed from the past where, the high command was sort of privy to all of the intelligence and research, whereas this more top-down approach to intelligence, I think, added to the overall success of the operation. So I'm not as concerned about the nation-making narrative that Vimy is often presented, but rather how the Canadians actually managed to pull off this military victory against one of the most fortified German positions on the Western Front. So here we have a close-up of the Vimy map with the original handwritten fall of shot coordinates made by the gunners, you can see there. So these seemingly simple barrage coordinates help to explain the larger reasons for the Canadian victory at Vimy. I would argue that the employment of artillery at Vimy was the single most influential factor driving the Canadians to that ultimate victory. So there are two major pillars of the artillery at Vimy that this special map will help me to explain, which are the counter battery work and the famous creeping barrage. Obviously, I could say much more on this, but I'm going to leave it to these two. So counter battery work, or in other words, the targeted destruction of enemy guns, was essential in supporting the infantry's advance and in limiting Canadian casualties on the ridge. So the Canadian Counter Battery Staff Office, which was formed in January 1917 under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Andrew McNaughton, coordinated the Canadian counter battery work at Vimy. McNaughton, who was a young engineering professor from McGill, he borrowed from techniques that were developed from the British and the French, and he improved upon. So McNaughton and his staff developed complex mathematical equations for better calculating the fall of shot of their guns, known as artillery or counter battery science. McNaughton's artillery calculations considered precipitation, barometric pressure, wind speed, and barrel wear, all of which could alter the fall of shot of the artillery. Precise calculations which are actually represented in the numbered drawings on the map that you see here. So in addition to that science, the Counter Battery Staff Office used the techniques of flash spotting and sound ranging, which together with greatly improved aerial and ground reconnaissance, allowed the Canadians to more accurately locate German batteries on the field. The Canadian Counter Battery Staff Office worked closely with the Royal Flying Corps to compose updated maps of enemy batteries and defensive positions. With the refined artillery science and location techniques and intelligence at their disposal, the Canadians were able to destroy a staggering 83% of the 212 German guns at Vimy. This was no small feat. So here we have the taking of Vimy Ridge, Easter Monday, 1917, which was painted in 1919 by war artist Richard Jack. So really quickly before I move on here, I'm just going to touch upon the creeping barrage, which I'm sure most of you know more than enough of. So I'm not going to hang on this too long for obvious reasons. So creeping barrage is basically a tactic that called for the artillery to fire directly in front of its own infantry advances, which was rolling forward at the infantry's walking pace in order to suppress enemies into their dugouts and only letting up once the friendly infantry was in range to strike and the enemy unable to man their parapets and small arms. So the heavy preliminary bombardment prior to the Somme offensive in 1916 taught the gunners at Vimy that even despite 1 million shells fired over a week in the heaviest barrage of the war, total annihilation of enemy lines was impossible. The infantry simply could not win appreciable ground without the consistent cover of their artillery. Andrew McNaughton later wrote in an academic article that, quote, by 1917, the organization of the Canadian Corps Artillery and its ancillary intelligence and other services had reached an advanced state, and that our lead over similar organizations was maintained to the end of the war. So moving on here, this is our second object, which comes from our great uniform collection, of course. So this here is a Canadian First World War non-commissioned officer's service dress jacket and cap. You just knew I was going to feature at least one of our First World War uniforms. So it's just too great of a collection not to feature at least one of them in most of my talks, it seems. So the uniform you see here, it's named to a Regimental Sergeant Major, Walter Stillwell of Winnipeg, Manitoba. So Stillwell served in Lord Strathcona's Horse from 1912 through the entire First World War, and even into the post-war, he re-enlisted. So this set was donated to the RCMI Museum in 2019 as a part of the J. Victor Teboyka collection. The uniform remains, in, obviously, as you can see in the photos, it's excellent condition. You got the diamond patch there. The cuff insignia for the RSM, collar badges, regimental buttons. It's just a real piece of art. The Canadian First World War uniforms with such ironclad provenance, such as Stillwell's, have become increasingly rare and valuable in the current climate. So let me just provide a little bit of background on the material history of uniforms in the First World War. So during the war, British and Canadian officers were responsible for having their own uniforms tailored on their own accord and expense. So in other words, they were privately purchased. The independent tailoring of uniforms accounts for the great number of differing colors found in First World War officers' tunics. Each Allied officer would have selected a type of khaki fabric available at their respective tailor. You see ranges of brown, even mustard yellow I've seen, and every shade of green imaginable. There was a very large industry of tailors operating in France, England, and in Canada during the war, as officers would frequently replace their jackets once wear and filth had taken its toll. So standing collars such as the one on Stillwell's here are often a sign of a Canadian-made jacket. So Stillwell himself was a career army man who began his service with the Royal Irish Regiment at the age of 14, if you can believe it, and had served for a total of 21 years at the time of his attestation for war in 1914. So he was already a grizzled veteran. He had been on the Indian frontier of the 1897 and of Samana, and he was then serving as the Strathcona's regimental quartermaster sergeant, where that basically functioned as the deputy to the RSM, which he would later be appointed. So Stillwell, with the rest of the Strathcona's Horse, they trained at Valcartier, Quebec in 1914, and they departed that same year for England in October. So this leads me into sort of the cavalry connection of all this and Stillwell's uniform. I think there's a lot of misinformation and sort of popular perception when it comes to the cavalry in the First World War. So, as I said, like the dominant perception on cavalry in the war tells us that it was incongruent and even anachronistic to the modern battlefield, having been supplanted by the newly introduced tanks from 1916. The first 2 years of the war, in regards to the cavalry, are almost always characterized as a violent learning curve where 19th century style charges were met by the unforgiving Armageddon, machine gun and artillery fire. What use could the horse still serve against, the newly mechanized war machine? But I would say that despite these popular depictions, the cavalry, and especially Strathcona's Horse, still had a role to play in winning the First World War. So from 1917, cavalry units played an essential part in gathering reconnaissance, rapidly consolidating recently captured positions, and defending against the ensuing German counterattacks. Keep in mind that the Canadian cavalry units of the war continued to fight both mounted and unmounted in sort of a hybrid style. For instance, cavalrymen would ride quickly to consolidate a position. The horse sort of gave them that advantage of speed, and they would dismount and establish a defensive posture with the Hotchkiss machine gun, the same weapon that I showed you earlier. So the last sort of example I'll give here, and many of you I'm sure are familiar with in terms of the cavalry's impact on the war. So in March 1918, the Germans launched their final offensive of the war, Spring Offensive, which was ultimately halted and countered by the Allies' 100 Days in August 1918. These two offensives of 1918 broke the vaunted trench stalemate and allowed for significant mobility on the Western Front than in the previous 4 years combined. So this great movement, which was really created by the climate of the Spring Offensive, provided further opportunities for the cavalry to exploit their mobility and the speed and precision strikes against enemy infantry and in defensive rearguard actions. And perhaps an ironic development, the mounted attack, which had been largely abandoned by 1915, would return to relevancy in the war's final chapter as mobile warfare would define the final year of the conflict. So in the cavalry's climactic moment of the war, at Moriel Wood on the 30th of March 1918, Canadian Lieutenant Gordon Flowerdew of Strathcona's Horse, same regiment of Stillwell, led his squadron into a dramatic cavalry charge headlong into German lines and the ensuing machine gun fire. With their sabers drawn in a moment probably more reminiscent of something from the Crimean War, Flowerdew's brilliant charge broke the enemy lines and halted the German offensive in that crucial moment. Germany from then on would fight a losing war against the Allies through to the armistice. This was the high watermark of the German army and really a stunning moment in world history. So that this final conventional cavalry charge was successful. Lieutenant Flowerdew was actually fatally wounded in the action. And I'll share this last quote before I move on to our third artifact. So the wartime commanding officer of the Canadian Cavalry Brigade was Brigadier General Jack Seeley, who later wrote in his 1930 memoir adventure, "A man with Flowerdew told me his last words as he and his horse finally crashed to the ground. He had 2 bullet wounds through his chest and was shot through both thighs. And he still had strength to shout quite loudly, 'Carry on, boys, we have won.' And so they had. There can be no doubt this officer's great valor was the prime factor in the capture of the position." Flowerdew, of course, a friend of Walter Stillwell's, coincidentally enough, would posthumously win the Victoria Cross for his action at Moriel Wood. And here, for your interest as well, we have probably the most famous portrait of Brigadier General Seeley and his war steed Warrior, which was created by the British equestrian and war artist Alfred Munnings. This leads me to my third object of 4. And this, of course, is the mighty Mark 1914 Colt machine gun. So this exact example that you see here in its newly minted display case, which we actually just put in September, was donated to the RCMI in 1988, a good year, by Lieutenant Colonel James Stokes. However, this weapon you see here has never been on permanent display until this past September, when we had a custom display case manufactured for this purpose. So this Colt, as you can see in its display case, is complete with the original ammunition box, belt, the bullets. It's really a great piece. You just don't see it all together very often. So the RCMI actually now claims the rare distinction of concurrently displaying all 4 major machine guns used by the Canadian Expeditionary Force during the First World War. I would say outside of perhaps the Canadian War Museum and the Military Museums of Calgary, where I used to work, it's unlikely that any other museum in Canada possesses examples of all 4 CEF machine guns, let alone displays all 4 like we do. So in addition to the Mark 1914 Colt, the other 4 include the Lewis gun, the Vickers, and the 2 times mentioned Hotchkiss. So really, we're really blessed to have all 4 of these major machine guns. So about the Colt itself, it was actually introduced in 1895. And it's been adopted by many nations throughout its manufacture. So the first Canadian use of the Colt actually happened during the Boer War, which was Canada's first overseas war. But the model 1914 Colt, introduced in that year, the type seen here, was a belt-fed, gas-operated machine gun designed to fire at 450 rounds per minute from a standing tripod. And you can see exactly right here. So the Colt set up here on its tripod, as it would have been on the Western Front. This photo is actually from a training exercise at Exhibition Park here in Toronto, which was taken in early 1915. The three individuals in the shot are actually members of the 20th Battalion, which was a unit perpetuated by the Queen's York Rangers based out of the Fort York Armory in Toronto. I just want to say thanks to my assistant curator, Jeremy Hood, for the great photo, which is going to be part of the exhibition. So like many of the Allied small arms of the First World War, the Colt used the .303 ammunition, and many of these rounds, I'm sure you know, were manufactured in factories right here in Toronto. But the Colt is rarely seen in museums because it was almost exclusively used in the early years of the war, so between 1914 and 1916, including perhaps most notably at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. So many of you have perhaps heard of the Mark 1914 Colt's infamous nickname, the potato digger. So the Colt earned this weird moniker because its gas lever would often kick up dirt and debris while firing. So on the gun, basically, the lever would extend up and down almost to a 90-degree angle and sort of kicking up dirt, as it was firing. So it was kind of an odd, sight to see. So the effect, was particularly pronounced when the legs of the tripod were spread far apart and the gun nested lower to the ground, or near a parapet wall, which I'll show you in a moment. So the Mark 1914 Colt was widely replaced by the more reliable and operable Vickers in 1916. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Canadian machine gun Corps, which was formed in April 1917, utilized the superior Vickers machine gun in the design of its cap and collar badges. So the 1st Canadian Motor Machine Gun Brigade, which was raised in August 1914, continued to use the original Colt on its badges. The two you can see here, really great examples. The one on the left there that shows the Colt, so the 1st Motor Machine Gun Brigade. I just want to say how great it is, the detail. You can see the belt going in the right side of the gun, which is the correct side of the gun, which is the left side. And it's really a beautiful, beautiful piece. And of course, you got the beaver on the top there, the Canadian influence. So it's just really a chef's kiss, I guess. So back to the RCMI's Colt before I move on to the last item on my list. So this Colt is particularly special. You can kind of see on the stenciling on the side of the gun that it was donated to the 19th Canadian Battalion, that this office behind me belonged to. And it was donated obviously to the battalion by the McLaren family in 1915. Actually, Lieutenant Colonel John Inglis McLaren was the original commanding officer of the 19th Battalion. Mrs. J.A., who's actually stenciled on the weapon, was his wife. So great connection there. So quick line on this is that, the purchasing and the donating of weapons and equipment by wealthy Canadian families for specific regiments was a common practice at the time. These wealthy families or benefactors would donate these items as their contribution to the war effort, generally at a ceremony, prior to the departure of the unit. So this is sort of my last slide before I move on to the 4th object, and I really want to show you kind of the Colt in action. There are no known photos that exist of the Second Battle of Ypres, but this is our best depiction. Again, you see here I've actually cropped, Richard Jack's piece, which hangs in the War Museum, kind of featuring the Colt in battle. So like the Ross rifle, I'd say, it's been much maligned in history. The weapon was not as reliable or as easy to operate as the Victors, but it did have an impact on those early years of the war. And it continued to be used by some of the armored cars in the Motor Machine Gun Brigade. So it's kind of a defense of the Colt as well. It's not as nice as the Vickers, but really was a solid gun. So I'm going to move on to my 4th piece here, just to keep in time. So the last piece is really one of the masterpieces of the RCMI collection, which is the Sopwith triplane of Propeller of Captain Arthur Roy Brown. So this piece is so unique and so special to the history for several reasons. Off the top, there are relatively very few original pieces of First World War aircraft still surviving anywhere in the world. Almost any complete First World War aircraft that you will see today is a reproduction. So on top of that scarcity, the Sopwith triplane was a very rare aircraft in itself. Only a total of 147 or so were manufactured during the war, compared to the more common Sopwith Pup, where approximately 1,800 were manufactured. So And then on the very crest, on this mountain of rarity, this propeller originally belonged, to the aircraft flown by the illustrious Captain Roy Brown. And it was maintained, by his direct descendants for a full 100 years. The provenance simply doesn't get any better than this, so it's an outstanding piece. The object itself was actually donated to us by Roy Brown's granddaughter, Catherine Brown, on the 21st of April in 2018 for the occasion of the centennial of the Red Baron's death. So we can see it a little closer in here. And Brown, he actually mounted his photograph inside of the propeller. And to the left of the portrait, you can see we have a very crisp and well-preserved maker's mark of the Westland Aircraft Works, which was a notable British aircraft manufacturer at the time. Of course, and this is just a quick point before I move into my conclusions. The Royal Canadian Air Force obviously would not exist until 1924, but approximately 22,000 Canadians would serve in Britain's air services during the war. The Royal Flying Corps, the Royal Naval Air Service, and of course the amalgamation of those two on the 1st of April 1918, the Royal Air Force. So Roy Brown was actually one of the only 936 Canadians who served in the Royal Naval Air Service. And following that amalgamation in April 1918, he was made squadron leader of the RAF 209. So it's pretty significant. And obviously, Brown himself, most of us know, quick bonus artifact. These are Roy Brown's original pilot's qualification badge from 1915 when he graduated from the Royal Naval Air Service. His name is obviously most famously associated with the defeat of the Red Baron. So, on April 21st, 1918, over Moulin-Court Ridge in northern France, as the story goes, the Red Baron was in pursuit of an inexperienced Canadian pilot, Watt May. So Brown, who was a great protector of his inexperienced pilots, began to pursue Richtofen in return, firing on him. Richtofen, was almost like possessed, trying to get after Watt May, coming closer to the ground. The Australians, as they're over top of their lines, start firing at them with Lewis guns and Lee Enfields. Somewhere in that melee, the Red Baron takes a shot through the lung, lands his plane, and is basically killed on impact. But I'll say this before I end, is that in my research, it's very evident that Roy, despite the fame of being associated with the Red Baron, did not embrace his role in killing, nor did he view it as his greatest wartime achievements. He took much more pride than that in his time as squadron leader, that he never lost a single wingman under his command, which is a remarkable achievement, considering that the average lifespan of an airman for the Great War was about 10 weeks, depending on the time and the year, but average was about 10 weeks. So it's really a remarkable achievement that he never lost one wingman. As far as I've encountered, Brown is the only Allied squadron leader of any significant amount of time during the war, which has this distinction to his name. So the Brown, he did survive the war, just final point here, but the physical and the mental toll was very apparent on him. And he actually died at age 50 in 1944. And if you see the photos from that time, he looks probably 75. So it's just amazing, those who survived the war, who continued on in regular life, they were still very much impacted by it. And these are somewhat of the uncounted casualties, so to speak, of the war. So this photo here, just for your interest, before I conclude, is actually an original photograph from our collection of Roy Brown with his Sopwith BR-1 Camel at the Bertangles Aerodrome in April 19, about 2 weeks before the engagement with the Red Baron himself. Great photo. So this leads me to the end, and let me just say this. So Canada's great, numerous contributions to the Allied victory in the First World War have resulted in a lasting proliferation of an exceptional material history. These objects serve as gateways or connections into the discourse of the larger historical narrative. Seen as unique and interesting primary sources, these military artifacts are valuable to not only the enhancement of the written historical record, but in engaging more Canadians with their history. Our First World War artifacts continue to provide a testament and a voice to that great generation, which is now entirely passed on. I think it's one thing I'll say, to read in a textbook, to read it in a history. It's another thing entirely, when there are no veterans left, to see these uniforms and these objects still in existence. I think it brings a real quality to it, an authenticity that these events actually happened. Now, so we've looked at 4 objects today, and we've explored the histories and the individuals within them. But Canada's entire military history can be explored through the depth of its rich military history, which are present within many of our excellent cultural institutions. The history of the First World War still matters to Canada, irrespective of the now past centennial. The war is still felt, and though we are no longer, have any living connection to the conflict, we share in its history as Canadians, and we are all therefore share in the responsibility for remembering and for perpetuating this history. More than ever, we must continue to stay vigilant and passionate for the importance of remembrance and commemoration. Thank you for listening and for joining me on this journey through a small window of our material history. Okay, I'll now invite our question and answer period. So for anyone who has any questions for myself or for Tyler at this time, I'd invite you to sort of submit it into the chat box below under Q&A. So we'll just sort of give people a couple minutes to come up with any questions that they might have. But Tyler, I had one for you. Tyler, I was curious, have you encountered any veterans of the Spanish Civil War in your time? Because it's really not something that's presented in Canada very often. I think, as you said in your talk and alluded to, that these were sort of the forgotten veterans. There was no formal parade on their return, and yet the fighting was, very grim. It was very, significant. So I'd be interested to hear your take on the living memory that you've experienced.
Well, unfortunately, I came to the show a little late. So by the time I'd started researching Canadians in the Spanish Civil War, Jules Paveo, who was the last of the Canadian volunteers, had just passed away. I was fortunate enough to meet and get to know Bill Crame pretty well. Bill Crame wasn't a member of the international brigades. Bill Crame was a Torontonian who went to Barcelona and worked with the quasi-Trotskyist POUM. A lot of ways you can characterize the POUM, but I'll just leave it at the George Orwell side from Homage to Catalonia. So not of the international brigades. And he didn't see any action, although he went to the front a few times. So that's the only living connection I really had with people who were in the Spanish Civil War, was getting to speak to this 105-year-old man, which was his age when he passed away 2 years ago, and hear about his time in Barcelona. In terms of how it's remembered, it's remembered. They actually did receive a bit of a parade when they came back, although they left quietly because they left illegally. Once it was determined that there were not going to be arrests, although many would be monitored by the RCMP until at least the 1960s. There was a church parade, for instance, at St. Mary Magdalene Anglican Church here in Toronto. There was a large celebration at Massey Hall, of all places, where members of the Spanish consulate and city officials actually were there and did welcome them. So it wasn't and at least 10,000 people greeted the main body when they arrived at Union Station in 1939. So it wasn't a major welcome in terms of a official, sanctioned, organized thing, but the public very much did rally and saw a lot of them as heroes when they returned. So they had that, but then the Second World War quickly kind of eradicated their memory until it was taken up as a cause after the Second World War again.
Just further to that, Tyler, why do you think that the historiography, excuse me, has been so minimal when it comes to Canada and the Spanish Civil War?
Some of it is, to be blunt, due to Communist Party meddling in how the story would be told. So, for instance, Edward Cecil Smith was contracted to write the official history of the MacPaps when he got back. However, the meddling from the Communist Party of Canada and how the story would be told was so significant that he shelved the project and never picked it up again. By the time anyone saw fit to undertake the project in the 60s, it was built off of a series of oral history interviews that were done. And not to criticize students of literature, but it wasn't military historians writing the first few books on the subject. It was of more interest to historians of literature. So I've gone back and I've listened to the oral histories that were given. And in the translation, there were a lot of mistakes made about what the volunteers were talking about. And there was also a lot of self-censorship, because in the early 1960s, they didn't want to talk about what the Red Army advisor had taught them about defensive operations, or what the mentor in the field actually told them to do. So there's a lot of, well, why do you want me to talk about that? Why? No, I'm not going to tell you his name. A lot of those kinds of reactions on the tapes.
Thank you for that, Tyler. I'll bring in some of the other questions here now. They're starting to come in. Quickly, Jim Walker says, no question, but very well presented to you both. Thanks for that. Brian asks, what was the rate of the fire for the Vickers machine gun? Technical question, but yeah, it had about a rate of fire of 450 to 500 rounds per minute. But the real advantage was it was much smoother than the Colt. We have both obviously on display now. But the big problem with the Colt is that, because, the belt was feeding through it, it didn't have just like an opening chamber if it got jammed, it was a real problem for them. Whereas the Vickers, and, I've operated it, myself, quickly open it up. There's a crank within 2 or 3 seconds, you can remove a jam. So the soldiers were, much preferred the Vickers, even though the rate of fire was similar between machine guns. So thanks for that question. Question here about Roy Brown. Did Roy Brown believe he shot down the Red Baron? What did you think of the other claims? How did the RCMI come to have the chair? Yeah, obviously, the Red Baron, Roy Brown, it's, I would say, historically what the RCMI is known for. In terms of Roy Brown's account, from all of his letters and memoirs that I've read, he really wasn't concerned with who delivered the killing blow. He was given the official credit, by the Royal Air Force. They were firing. Roy was pushing him into that position. So I would say, if anything, it was a team effort. And, whenever he was interviewed in the post-war about this, because there was always interest, the man who killed the Red Baron, he was always like, that's not what I want to be known for. I was, an effective squadron leader who never lost a man under my command. So I think he was, like, what I can tell, uncomfortable with the association. And he really didn't, it didn't matter to him. It was like, our job was to win the war. Who ended up got the killing blow, I don't really care, I think was his impression. In terms of how the chair, the relics of the Red Baron, for those who don't know, we have the cockpit chair, a strip of the fuselage, and a wingtip from the Red Baron's actual chair, which were all actually war trophies of Roy Brown. He was a member of the RCMI. So in 1920, when he came back, there's this big procession down University Avenue where he's carrying the chair, and he donated those to the RCMI at that time. The strip of the fuselage, actually, which is on the back of the exhibit, it's great. It's still got the red paint from the Fokker triplane. And in the middle, it's actually been kind of scrubbed away by his squadron mates. And they all signed their name, including Walt May. So it's a really great primary source as well. And they actually gifted this to Roy while he was recovering in the hospital from his injuries. He actually sustained at least 31 broken bones during the First World War. So pretty significant, time. And I didn't have time to share some of his letters where he actually details sending this propeller home. But he talks about how unreliable, very casually, but he talks about how unreliable these aircraft were, which were essentially prototypes. They would nose over, they would fail mid-flight. The tracers that were meant, to fire through the propeller didn't always work, so they would split them mid-air and they would have to crash land. Like the one statistic I think of is that there are more British and Canadian pilots in the First World War that were killed in training than were killed by the Germans. So it really is a great example for how, just how unsafe these machines actually were. So anyway, that's a little bit of the material history of Roy Brown. And it's all on display at the RCMI if you ever want to come see it. This next one, Tyler, is for you. Did any of the Mackenzie Papineaus join the Canadian military in World War II?
Yes, many did. So I can't speak to numbers. I'm working on that. I'm trying to figure out how many popped up. However, there's some interesting dimensions to the experiences of those who did, because the Communist Party of Canada line on the Second World War was initially, it was viewed to be a anti-fascist war. However, then the non-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin was signed, and the communist parties of the world fell in line with that. So they, within the first few weeks of the war, they shifted from being pro-war to anti-war. And it wasn't until Germany invaded the Soviet Union that they flipped again and became extraordinarily pro-war, advocating for the immediate invasion of Europe, advocating for no strike pledges among workers. So those trends play out, because in the first few weeks of the Second World War, Cecil Smith wrote to the Minister of National Defense and offered to lead the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion into battle in Poland. Now that's, I think, a fascinating what if kind of question. Obviously, the offer was politely declined. Cecil Smith was among those who did join the Canadian Army. However, he was trumped out by the RCMP, even though the military was quite happy with his performance and having this former battalion commander. He actually joined as a sapper, joined the engineers, which is where he began his career in the militia. But he was drummed out by the RCMP. Fortunately, Cecil Smith's eyesight was so bad that he was actually released on medical grounds. He'd only passed in the first place because he had memorized the eye chart. So he could recite the letters, pass the eyesight test, and they ultimately used that for his commanding officer to give him the honorable discharge, which is why he spent his last days in Sunnybrook Hospital, because of just those few months in a Canadian Army uniform during the Second World War. And then there was another wave after the German invasion of the Soviet Union, where many of the MacPaps come out of the woodwork and join the Canadian Army and fight in the Second World War. And the same was true in the United States as well.
Thanks for that, Tyler. We've got a couple more questions before we cut into our break here, so just stay with us. This one comes from Petros. He asks, given the importance of authenticity in artifacts, what is your opinion on modern replicas and the role that they play in helping engage modern audiences? I'm thinking, for example, of World War I replica aircraft you mentioned, or even the Mark IV tank at the Bovington Tank Museum, which was used in Warhorse. Interesting question. My personal, professional, display mandate is I love putting the real thing on display, first and foremost, at museums. People don't come to museums, generally speaking, to see replicas and reproduction. They want to see the genuine article, the objects, that were there. They have a certain quality that modern, replicas can't. They just can't compare. But I will say that there is value to replicas. And I think as an educational tool, I used to run the education programs at the military museums in Calgary. They're great for, artifact handling days, bringing people into the history, for movie sets, as you said, because you're not going to use, artifacts are so delicate, and even displaying them for long periods of time, being exposed to light, humidity, and other factors, they're going to degrade being out. So replicas have that ability that it doesn't really matter if they break down or get, ripped apart by children on an education day because, they're replicas. So they have that ability that we don't need to preserve them, but we can use them as a tool for education and outreach. And so I do think that they have a place, and in gaps of the collection where if you don't have an example of something, they can also bolster your collection. I mean, you don't have to always put the originals on display if there's small things to kind of complete the set. So hopefully that answers the question. Last question I'll answer for this period regarding the Colt. Did any other countries, this is from my assistant curator, Jeremy Hood, did any other countries have Colt potato diggers in action during World War I? Good question, Jeremy. Yeah, it was actually, used by many nations even after the First World War. But in the First World War itself, it was used widely by the Russian army. The Mark, this is a trivia question, but the Mark 1895 Colt was actually the first machine gun that was ever adopted by the US military. So it was used widely by them once they entered the war. It was obviously used by the Commonwealth nations as well in the first 2 years of the war, and by Britain as well. But it was almost out of the line entirely by 1916 when the Vickers just surpassed it in every way. So thanks for your question. Last one, I guess I'll answer really quick before we end here for break. What steps do you have to, this is from Anna, England, what steps do you have to take to help preserve or conserve the artifacts you have in the RCMI collection? Of course, that's a detailed question, but one advantage we have at the RCMI is all of our artifacts are stored on site. So when they rebuilt the RCMI in 2014, it's always had its current location. But in 2010, they demolished the old building. They built a new state-of-the-art facility. So we have, new display spaces. We monitor for humidity. We spend money on through Carr McLean on proper racks and everything we can to properly monitor and to store our collection to the best of our ability. But any museum, provincial, federal institutions, the problem we all have is space and best practice. So what I would just say is you do the best with what you have, both with resources, staff, and space. And I say that's what we try and achieve at RCMI. And it's always a challenge, but as museum professionals, we do have a great team here at the RCMI. I just want to say thank you for all of those questions, and thank you, Tyler, for your presentation and for your time during this Q&A. We're now going to break for, let's see, what we're doing for time. I'd say we will come back in 15 minutes. So at, we'll say 1:45, we'll resume our presentation with which will be Andy Travers on the Anglo-Zulu Wars. So take 15, 1:45, we'll return and we'll resume our session. Thank you so much.